We are on Daf Nun Beis 52b, and we actually turned the page to 53a. So let's just go over what we learned. The Gemara explained the Mishnah, where the Mishnah had said that there are certain candles, certain spices a person cannot recite Havdalah with, and the specific cases that it mentions is the ner or besamim of a goy, the ner, which means the fire and the spices of a non-Jew, the ner and the fire of a deceased person, and also the fire and spices of avodah zarah. So the Gemara tries to understand what are we referring to when we talk about these types of candles and spices that you can't use. So we tried to understand the fire was maybe an issue of a prohibited fire that was lit or it was used for work on Shabbos. And the Gemara said that's not going to help us with the spices. Again, we're talking about the fire and spices of a guy, and the fire we could say was probably lit on Shabbos, but so it wasn't a fire that rested, so to speak. But that's not going to help us. What about the spices? So then the Gemara said, you know what we're talking about? We're talking about the fact that that the Goyim used both the fire and spices for partying for Avodah Zarah. So and the Gemara said, and even though the Mishnah seems to imply like there's separate issues, one is the Avodah Zarah, the idol worship, and the other is just simply that it's a goy's fire and a goy's spices. The Gemara says, no, that's not the meaning. It's actually one case. One is explaining the other. You know why you can't use a goy's fire and a goy's spices? Because they use it for idol worship. And therefore you can't recite a bracha on it. It's mipnei, because stam mesibas goyim avodas koichavim is la'avodah zarah. The assumption of a party of goyim is that they're going to use it for avodah zarah. So then the Gemara said that there's also an issue of using a fire that didn't rest on Shabbos. So we have the Avodah Zarah issue, the idol worship issue, but there are also other issues with regard to a fire that didn't rest. That is a problem. That's a fire that can't be used. But what type of fire are we talking about? And this is where it does get a little hard to understand the technical differences in why certain cases permissible and other cases is not permissible. For example, the case that the Gemara gives of I should say the Brisa, the case that the Gemara brings a Brisa that if you lit a fire for someone who's in a very dangerous life and death situation, like a woman who gave birth or someone who's very sick, and you lit a fire for them on Shabbos, that fire after Shabbos, you are allowed to use for Havdalah, to recite the blessing on the fire. You mean you lit it on Shabbos? No, but that fire was allowed to be lit on Shabbos because it was for someone who's deathly ill. And there you're allowed to transgress Shabbos for such a person. And therefore it was permissible. That was considered a permissible fire. So what is a fire that's not permissible? Fire that's not permissible is that it did not rest from sin. In other words, a sin, so to speak, melechas avera, a malacha, a work of a sin was done with it. And the Gemara then mentions that if a person has a flame that was burning all of Shabbos, you are allowed to use that, because even though it was burning on Shabbos, but you didn't light it on Shabbos. It was burning throughout Shabbos. And since it was burning throughout Shabbos, you lit it before Shabbos began. So then you are allowed to use that for the Havdalah, because that, that's not a sin. That was a fire that was burning on Shabbos, but it was not, no sin was no act was done with it, and no sin was done. Now, then the Gemara brings the brisa, and this is where it gets the issue really. You see a little, you have to really think deeper into it, because then the brisa brings a case where a guy lit a flame after Shabbos from a Jew's fire that was lit on Shabbos. Now, the assumption is the Jew lit it not in a permissible way, but in a sinful way. He was not allowed to light the fire on Shabbos, and he lit it. And then after Shabbos, a guy takes from that fire and he burns something, uses that fire to ignite something else. So the guy now has a fire that was lit from a Jew's fire that was a transgression. So here you start having different ways of looking at it. Is this considered the same fire? You just took that fire from there. So this is a fire that, that was lit in a prohibited manner? Or do we look at it that it's really a new fire? You took advantage of the flame that was there and you ignited something else. Is this new ignition, is this considered a new fire, or is it really a continuation of the other fire? Is it really the same as the other fire? And so from this part of the brisa says a guy lit it from a Jew's fire, or a Jew lit it from a non-Jew's flame. So the law was you are allowed to recite a bracha on this fire. What does that sound like? It sounds like, okay, I guess it's considered when you light one flame from a different flame, we only care about the final flame. We don't care about the original source. We don't care about the original flame, source of the fire, even though sin was done with it. It was lit on Shabbos. We only care about the final flame. It sounds from there that we look at this as two separate flames. There's the original flame, and then when you light something from that, it's considered a new flame. And that new flame, we look at it and we judge it on its own merits. Was this lit on Shabbos? Was it lit after Shabbos? Okay, it's fine. Lit after Shabbos, it's going to be okay. So that's what it sounds like. The only problem is then the next sentence of the brisa says that a non-Jew lit a flame from another non-Jew who lit it on Shabbos. So now we've got what you would think should be permissible, right? He lit the second non-Jew lit it after Shabbos. The first non-Jew lit it on Shabbos. So you would think, well, this is a new flame. It was lit after Shabbos. We don't consider it the same flame as the source flame, as the original flame. This is a new flame. So logic would tell you should be permissible, right? A Jew lit from a non-Jew was permissible. A non-Jew lit from a Jew was permissible. Now we have a non-Jew lighting from another non-Jew. Okay, it should be permissible. Why not? And the brisa says it's prohibited. That's prohibited. All of a sudden, this you can't do. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Is it considered the same flame, or is it considered a different flame? Make up your mind. From the first two cases, it sounds like it's considered like a new flame. We look at it as a different flame, different fire. From the final case, where it talks about a guy lighting from another guy, then we say, no, it's the same. Make up your mind. Is it the same flame or is it a different flame? So the Gemara says that why is it not good a goy from a goy? Because the original flame did not rest. If so, a Jew from a goy, also the original flame didn't rest. And then maybe you're going to say that, well, the original fire is left, and you're going to say, and this is considered a new fire, and it's considered that the second person, the Jew, created the new fire. We don't look at the original fire that was lit on Shabbos. If you're going to say that, how are you going to explain a brisa that talks about carrying on Shabbos? And the brisa over there mentions that if you carry a flame on Shabbos from the Rishus Hayachid, from a private domain, to a Rishus Harabim, to a public domain, the person gets a penalty, chayiv. He is guilty, he is punishable. And the Gemara asks, why is he chayiv? Why is he considered obligated? Why is he deserving of a penalty? Masha akar lohi niach, what he uprooted, he didn't put down, because after a flame burns, it should be looked at as this is new. Every moment is like a new moment of the flame. So if you carry this flame, the flame that you're carrying is really a different flame that you're putting down. So in order to be punishable for the laws of Shabbos, you would need to lift up an item, take it outside to the public domain, and then put it down. You need three things in order to be obligated and to be punished for the laws of Shabbos. You need to have an akira. You have to lift up an object from a private domain. Then you have to change domains with it, bring it into a public domain. And then you have to put it down in the public domain. So you have to lift it up, move it, and put it down. There are three parts to transgressing the laws of Shabbos, to the full extent of transgressing the laws of Shabbos. And the Gemara is asking, we should look at this as if it's a separate fire. Every moment is like a different fire. So why would you be chayiv? So the Gemara answers no. We look at it as if there's additional fire to it, but not that it's a new fire. It has the old fire, and there's some new fire with it. That's the way the Gemara understands it. There is the prohibited fire there, but when you say the bracha, you're reciting the bracha on the new fire, the new flame that is permissible flame. So that's the way the Gemara understands a flame to be considered. Is it considered the same as the original flame, or is it a new flame? It's both, really. You have the original flame there, you have new fire, and the same thing would apply to if you did spread the fire to a new item, but you kept the fire burning. That also would be considered the same thing. You have the old fire there, and you have a new flame, because when it burns, the more it burns, it's really considered like a new flame also. There's an additional flame that lights, some gets extinguished, some lights new. So there's the old flame and the new flame there. You have both. And that's why on the laws of Shabbos, if you carried a flame from one domain to another domain, and you put it down, you lifted it up and put it down, person is punishable by for transgressing the laws of Shabbos, because although there is some new flame there, but it's also considered the old flame as well is still there. Now, when it comes to the laws of Havdalah, so when you switch flame, when you spread the fire from one item to another item, we look at it as if you have the old flame, and you also have a little new flame, or some level of new flame. I don't know if you should call it a little, or there is also a taisepis. There is additional flame as well. And when you're reciting the bracha, you have to recite the bracha on the new flame. Why? Because the old flame was lit on Shabbos. So what we want, what we need is to be able to recite a bracha on a fire that didn't sin, that didn't have an act of sin done with it. So how do you have a fire that didn't have an act of sin, that it rested on Shabbos? You need to have the new flame. The additional part of the new flame is what you're really reciting the bracha on. Of course, you see both, but the specific, the technical element of it is that your bracha is really on the new flame, because the old flame you would not be able to recite a bracha. Now, getting back to our problem, that when you have a goy lighting a fire from another goy, what do you think the law should be then? So a non-Jew lit a fire on Shabbos, which, although he was allowed to, nevertheless, we consider it a fire that transgressed Shabbos, because officially that act is an act of transgression, such an act, even though we're not punishing the non-Jew, he didn't do anything wrong, but it's a fire. If you look at the fire, this is a fire that didn't rest on Shabbos. Now, because the act was an act of sin, therefore you can't use that fire for Havdalah. But nevertheless, in this case, a non-Jew lit it from the other non-Jew after Shabbos was over. So what should we say? Logically, you would say, well, it has some of the original fire there, and it also has additional fire. And because of the additional fire, logic would tell me that I should be able to recite a bracha on it. And the Brisa said no. So now we're trying to answer that case. Why is that case different? Yes, Yehuda.
But the original goy who lit the fire did not break the law.
That's true. That's true. And this is surprising, but the way we're looking at it is that we're looking at the flame. Is the flame a flame that rested? So if it was a flame that was lit on Shabbos, and it was lit for someone who was deathly ill, then we say that that flame is a kosher flame. It's called kosher, because the flame was lit for a person. The act of lighting it was an act that was a permissible act for anyone, a Jew, a non-Jew. That flame is a permissible flame. When a non-Jew lights the flame on Shabbos, and it is surprising, and I'm not telling you that I understand this fully, Yehuda. You have a very good question, but the way the way the Gemara is understanding it is, and something that, of course, we're going to try to understand better, is that if you look at the fire, this fire, it was an act of transgression of Shabbos was done with it. Not that the guy did a transgression, but it was lit in a prohibited way. Now, of course, if a guy lit it, it's fine. If a Jew lit it, it would be a terrible transgression. But if we look at the fire, this is called a fire that transgressed Shabbos, because if a Jew did it, it would have been a transgression. So we can't call this fire a fire that rested on Shabbos. When we look at the fire that was for the deathly ill person, there we take into consideration what was the reason why it was lit. It was lit for a person who needs it, and that for that person, there's no such thing as Shabbos. So we look at that fire and we say that fire is a permissible fire. Anyone could have lit it. On Shabbos, it was permissible. But when we look at the fire of the non-Jew that lit it, and of course, you're right, he didn't do anything wrong at all. He's 100% fine. But we can't say that fire rested on Shabbos, because if a Jew did it, it would have been prohibited. So you can't say that that act of that fire was a permissible fire. That we have to call a prohibited fire. Is it a little more understandable, Yehuda?
Well, it is, but, and I can accept that, but that contradicts the previous, where the Jew lit the fire, and that you said was acceptable.
Where a Jew lit the fire, it's for sure a considered a fire of sin if he lit it on Shabbos. But the thing is, if a non-Jew took fire from the Jew after Shabbos, then we do have additional fire that's there. That's a permissible fire mixed with a prohibited fire. And the same thing would apply a non-Jew as well. If a non-Jew lit the first fire and a Jew took from that flame to another fire, so that would be also, there's prohibited fire there, and then there's permissible fire that's added to it. And because of that, both of these scenarios you will be allowed to recite the bracha after Shabbos because there's additional permissible fire that was added to it. So when you're saying the bracha, you're really saying the bracha for the additional fire that's there. Is that understandable?
Not really.
What we're saying is that there's the first degree and there's the second degree. The first degree, you're pretty much correct about. I mean, there are some issues that I didn't explain more. I didn't go into. But if you want to think about it on a simple level, the first degree is the first guy who did it, who did it in a sinful way, and then the second degree is where someone else lit from that fire. And the Gemara's Gemara is bringing this brisa that seems to be saying that the first degree is a problem. The second degree, it has a problem in it, but it also has a permissible element to it. Because the second degree has permissible fire. You know, when you take a flame, do we look at it that it's the same as the old flame, or do we look at it as if it's a new flame? The Gemara said it's both. That's the way the Gemara explained it, that it's really both. You have the old flame there. So on the one hand, there is prohibited flame that you cannot say a bracha on, but there's also permissible flame that you can say a bracha on, because when you took the fire, you spread it to something else, that flame, the original flame is there, and there's new flame that's added to it, and therefore it should be okay. Therefore, you could say a bracha to it. And I see we have three people with questions.
I wanted to add to the same question of Yudas.
Yeah.
I wanted to add that why do we apply the laws of Shabbat to Havdalah, which is done after the Shabbat? It's done already when Shabbat is over.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're trying to learn what is considered the same flame and what is considered a different flame, and you see that in the laws of Shabbos. So we're not saying we have to follow that the laws of Shabbos apply after Shabbos, because they don't, but the facts of how Torah sees a flame, you can see from the laws of Shabbos. But so you're right, you don't have to keep...
The Havdalah is a new flame. I mean, it's taken from another flame. It's a secondary flame, like if you took it from a goy. It's secondary.
So what do we see from the laws of Shabbos about that?
Yeah, why is there a difference? That's what I...
What do we see from the laws of Shabbos? What does Shabbos teach us? The laws of Shabbos teach us that we look at it when it burns more further, the more it burns, we look at it still that it's the same flame, even though it took time until you got outside. It's not, it's not momentary. It does take time till you bring it to the public domain. And you see from there the concept that even though new flame is coming, we look at the old flame as if it's still in existence.
Because it was burning longer.
Because it burned longer. It's similar to level 2. It's similar to lighting one flame from another flame. We have a similarity there, and we're comparing the two. Okay, let's see. Robert.
My question is twofold. Maybe it's one. Let's say during olden times, Jews need to eat over Shabbos. And so therefore you had a flame lit like we do now for cholent. So the question is, can you then light the Havdalah candle from the flame that is heating the meal in the same thing? Let's say in contemporary time, you realize you don't have any matches, yes, but the cholent light is still on. So is it kosher to do it or not? Because that flame is working to provide food for you during Shabbos.
Right. You lit it before Shabbat.
Yeah, as Ezra said, the cholent is not a problem because the cholent flame was lit the whole time. Or if you, let's say you have
but the point is, but it's still working. It's doing something. It's creating heat relative to sustenance. Is that any violation of the separation? Okay.
Oh, so that's an interesting thing. In other words, if a fire was not lit for light, it was lit for burning or for some other purpose.
Right, to provide you sustenance during Shabbos.
So it's not really to give light.
Correct.
Not a flame that was meant to give light.
Right.
So the truth is, the Gemara, we do mention that idea that what is it meant for. So why don't you, let's put that question on hold, because it does talk about that when we talk about, we're going to talk about a flame that was lit to honor someone. So it's not really for light, it's for honoring. So that really touches on that.
It's of utility. It's essentially, it's of utility.
It's for the wrong purpose.
In its purest state. Okay, good.
Right.
Okay, good.
Yes, Ezra.
So can we use an analogy of, suppose that you had a meat pot and you accidentally drop a milk item, and you use the idea of batel b'shishim. You have an item which is prohibited, but it's in a pot that is permitted. Can't you use a similar logic to talk about a fire that may have been lit on Shabbat, but because of the fact that as time goes on, when you make the transfer, that part of the flame is becoming smaller and smaller, and so therefore the majority of the flame is what determines whether the flame is in fact a kosher flame.
So that's an interesting question. Do we take that into consideration, that it's batel b'shishim? And I think the question really works the opposite way, which is to be able to recite the bracha on the new flame, and I don't know that we need to say that the bad flame, the prohibited flame, is batel, because the fact is you have a new flame. The new flame, you're saying the bracha on. You're benefiting from the new flame. You're also benefiting from the old flame, okay, but you're benefiting from the new flame. So you don't need the prohibited flame to be batel, because you're really saying the bracha on the kosher flame. But what about the opposite case? The opposite case is where you have 98% old flame, and you only have 2% new flame, or 1% new flame, let's pick that. So you have 1% new flame. So in that case, can you really say I'm benefiting from the new flame if the old flame is so large? Are you allowed to say that I'm benefiting from the new flame if it's such a tiny percentage that's batel b'shishim? It's insignificant. It means maybe you're not really benefiting from the new. So that would really be a good question. We're going to be pulling up the Shulchan Aruch, Metz Hashem, if not today, then tomorrow, and we'll, Metz Hashem, try to see if we can find any hints to such a thing in the Shulchan Aruch, how that would work. But I think that would really be the question, Ezra, right? Would you say that would?
Well, my question is, even if we do the transfer, should we wait for a bit until the kosher flame becomes the dominant part of the overall flame?
Right. Okay. So in other words, to what extent do we look at it when you do when you do the transfer? Is that considered 50-50 right away? Do we look at it? Well, you took the flame from there. I mean, the fact is, it is burning from a new wick. So do we? Right. So to what extent? Okay, that's a good question. Right. So along the same lines. Okay. Very good. And let's Mordechai.
Yes. Yeah, when it comes to making a flame in general, well, where the two options are either making a new flame or getting it from somebody else. At least back in the days of the Gemara, it may have been easier to get a flame from another flame, whereas, of course, today it's generally easier to just strike a match. However, I want to point out that I think the halacha is that Motzei Yom Kippur, the fire for the Havdalah candle, Motzei Yom Kippur, dafka has to come from a flame that was previously burning.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mordechai mentions to all of us that excuse me. Excuse me. That there's a difference between the Saturday night, the Motzei Shabbos Havdalah candle, and the Motzei Yom Kippur, the Havdalah candle after Yom Kippur, because the Havdalah candle after Shabbos has to do with the creation of light. But the Havdalah candle after Yom Kippur, if Yom Kippur falls on a different day of the week, so let's say it falls on a Wednesday, so the Havdalah candle, then you do use a Havdalah candle after Yom Kippur. The Havdalah candle then it's not commemorating the fact that fire was created, because fire was not created on Wednesday night. The reason why you use a Havdalah candle then is because we were not able to use fire throughout Yom Kippur, and now we are able to use fire. So what we do is we use a fire that rested throughout Yom Kippur. So it's not about creating a fire. And therefore you don't light a new flame. You're supposed to, and some people you actually light a yahrzeit candle before Yom Kippur just to be able to use that flame after Yom Kippur to make Havdalah. You're supposed to use a flame that rested on Yom Kippur. So that's it's an important halacha to know that there's a difference between the Havdalah on Saturday night and Havdalah after Yom Kippur. Thank you, Mordechai. Now going back to our Gemara. So our Gemara says that the answer to this question has to do with the guy who's lighting a candle from another guy, that we are nervous. The rabbis made like a decree that you can't use that flame, even though logically it should be permissible. But they made a decree. They were nervous that it's going to cause people to make a mistake. The mistake people will make is that they're going to end up thinking that it's permissible to use a fire from a non-Jew directly, even if it wasn't lit from another non-Jew after Shabbos. In other words, you're going to end up, it's going to cause there to be a mistake. And therefore, the Gemara concludes that that is the reason of that brisa. The brisa says, a guy from a guy, you can't use that fire. A guy from a yid or yid from a guy, that you're allowed to use. Why? Because a guy from a guy, it's going to make a person think, I can use a fire that a guy lit on Shabbos. The guy lit it right at the end of Shabbos. I could use that fire. And really, that's the essence of the prohibition, is using a fire that was lit on Shabbos to recite Havdalah. That's prohibited. And that is, because of that, it looks too similar to a guy lighting from another guy. Therefore, the rabbis said that you can't use for Havdalah. Okay, so now we're going to start the next Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a brisa. And this Gemara is on page 53a. It's about 18 lines from the top of the page. It's the third wide line. Tuf Resh stands for Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis learned in a brisa. 53a. Haya Mahalech, if a person was going after Shabbos, Chutz Lakrach, outside of the city, Vera'a or, and he saw a flame. Or means light. Or means a flame. And he saw a flame, and of course he doesn't know if it's a Jew's flame or a non-Jew's flame. Imroiv Nachrim Einay Mavarich. If the majority of the people of the town are goyim, then you cannot recite a bracha on it. Imroiv Yisrael Mavarich, but if the majority of the people in town are Yidden, then you can recite a bracha because we can assume it's from the majority. And therefore you would be allowed to recite a bracha. The Gemara is not comfortable with this. Hagufa Kasha, this itself is a question. Amrit Imroiv Nachrim Einay Mavarich. You said that if the majority are goyim, then you cannot recite a bracha because you have to assume it's a non-Jew's light, and he lit it on Shabbos. Ha mechza, that implies, but if it would be half and half, if the city would be a city of half and half, Jews and non-Jews, then it would seem that you don't assume that it's a non-Jew. Only majority goyim, you assume it's from a non-Jew. But if it's half and half, that would imply that you could recite a bracha. V'hadar tani, and then afterwards it learns in the brisa, Imroiv Yisrael Mavarich. Only if you have the majority Jews in the city can you recite a bracha. And that implies ha mechza al mechza, but if it would be half and half, you would think Einay Mavarich. You cannot recite a bracha. So which one is the main statement? Does it have to be majority Jews to recite a bracha? Or is the majority non-Jews the deciding factor of not being able to make a bracha? Which one is the main point? Which one needs the majority? The Jews need the majority to recite a bracha. That means half and half. You can't recite the bracha. Or do the non-Jews need the majority in order to prohibit a bracha? But if you had half and half, you could still recite the bracha on the fire. The Gemara concludes, Bedinhu de afilu mechza al mechza. The Gemara answers this question and says, really, in truth, even half and half, you could recite the bracha. So when it says, if majority are non-Jews, you cannot recite a bracha, that's the real statement here. If it's half and half, you could recite a bracha. The ID, the Tana Reisha, Rav Nachrim, Tana Sefer, Rav Yisrael. But because of, to make the brisa symmetrical, the brisa used the words of majority this, then that's the law. Majority of that, then that the other thing is the law. The brisa just used the typical wording, but this is the emphasis is on the majority goyim. You cannot recite a bracha because we assume they lit it on Shabbos. And if it's majority Yidden, and here you see something interesting, that in the olden days, all Jews kept the Torah. They didn't have Jews that transgressed, because as long as you had majority, or not even majority, half and half. If half the city is Jewish, we assume it was lit by a kosher light. It's a kosher light. Kosher light, half the Jews. What do you mean? What about the Jews that don't keep Torah? Everyone kept Torah in the olden days. It's a new thing that you have people who aren't religious, or they're not so religious. They keep some things, they don't keep other things. In the Gemara, you see, look at that. It was, this is if it was half and half, Jews or non-Jews, it's already a kosher light. Now, the Gemara continues and says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a brisa. The rabbis learned in a brisa. If a person was going outside of a city, and he saw a child, and he had a torch in his hand. You should check afterwards. Im Yisrael if it's a Jewish child, you can say a bracha. Im Nachrihu einay mavarit. If it's a guy, then you can't say a bracha because it was probably lit on Shabbos. Now, you should check and find out if he's Jewish or not Jewish. The Gemara says, "My ir yatinai." Why does it mention a child? Afilu gadol nami. Even why is it talking about a child? Even an adult should be the same thing. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav says, "Hacha b'samach l'shkias achama askinan." Here we're talking about it's right after Shabbos. It's very close to sunset. And because of that, Gadol Mucha Milsa Devadai Nachlu. If it was an adult, for sure this must be a guy, because a Jew would never have lit it so close to the end of Shabbos. But a Tinaik, if it's a child, Ema Yisrael, who we can say that it's a Yid. Ikri v'naka, it happened that he took a fire immediately after Shabbos, and and that would be okay. In other words, a Jew would never have done that. A regular Jew, an adult, would never have done that. He would have given himself time before he would take hold of a fire. But with a child, it's possible. It happened that Shabbos is pretty much over, but because there might be a questionable, it's not 100%. It's not 100%. So therefore, if someone might be Jewish, it would be a child. If we have a thought that want to give such an example, it would be a child that you would give the example about, because that's the only one who would possibly be holding a candle right after Shabbos. It reminds me, last week I was in Shul, and they wanted a group of people to go to a Avel's house, the house of a mourner, right after Shabbos. So some guy pulled up his car to the door of the Shul. Wanted to get six. We were going to take 6 people, and we went to the house of a mourner right after Shabbos. So the thing is that the thing is that there were, there's different opinions as to when Shabbos is over. Some people wait, an hour after, like 45 minutes after candle lighting, 45 minutes after Shkia. Some people wait 60 minutes. Some people wait 72 minutes. The different numbers of time, how much you wait for Shabbos to be over, depending on also the location. It depends on how far you are from the equator. So there are different opinions as to when Shabbos is over. So we had 2 opinions in Shul of when Shabbos was over. One calendar said one time, and another calendar said about 5 minutes later. So the guy pulls up to Shul at the first moment that the calendar, the earliest time that you found a calendar that said this time, he pulled up right there. I said, do me a favor. I'm happy to come with you to help your minyan, but let's just wait for 5 minutes for the second time of the other calendar, just in case. We should be careful. It's a biblical obligation of keeping Shabbos. Let's just wait 5 minutes. Okay, you brought your car here. You followed the lenient calendar. Okay, no problem. But just wait a few minutes, and I'll be happy to join you for the minyan. So they waited for me. But the point is that right after Shabbos, a regular Yid is not rushing to do the moment that Shabbos is over, because you don't know 100%. Maybe your watch is off. Maybe this. You're not sure if this is the right calendar. Maybe So but a child might have done it. Child might have done something like that. Now there is a way of learning here that maybe the child lit the candle bein hashmashos, which is in between sunset and dusk. So there is such a way of learning. The Meiri mentions this. So a Yid would never have done that. So a Yid wouldn't hold a candle at that time, but an adult Yid. But a child might hold a candle during that time. Now, what's interesting about this Gemara is that the previous Gemara said we rely on the majority of people that live in this town. In the next Gemara that we learned, so the first Gemara we learned, we say we rely on, as long as it's not majority Goyim, you're okay. The next Gemara didn't mention anything about the majority. It just said, find out if it's a Yid or if it's not a Yid. Why is that? Why don't we rely on the majority in the second case? So the commentaries mention that must be that the second case is talking about that you have the ability to run after the child and catch him and see if it's a Yid or not a Yid. In other words, the first case, you should have done that as well, except that we're talking about a case. In the first case, you don't have the ability to go run after. It's far away, wherever this flame is, that by the time you get there, maybe the guy will have left or whatever. It might have gone out. So you don't have the ability to find out and be mavarer, to clarify if it's a Jew's flame or not a Jew's flame. But in the second case, we're talking about a case where the child, you could go to and ask him if he's Jewish or he's not Jewish. And therefore, we are able to ask him and find out if he's Jewish. And if he's Jewish, then you can recite the bracha on that flame. Now, Rashi says that you don't have to check after him if it's an adult. You know that it must have been a non-Jew. Because if it was a Jew, he would never have rushed so close to dark to hold a candle in his hand. So from Rashi, it seems that he's talking about Shabbos is over, but you don't rush to do the moment Shabbos is over to hold the candle. Now, when it comes to a child, then we say maybe it's a Jew, because a child might have rushed right after Shabbos to have this candle. Now, what I find interesting is that it doesn't emphasize that he lit it after Shabbos. It emphasizes that he's holding it. And an adult child would never hold this candle right after Shabbos. An adult would never hold this after. A child maybe would hold it after Shabbos. So I think that fits with the way the Meiri is learning, that it might be talking about bein hashmashos, which means in between sunset and dusk. And in that case, for sure, a child would not have lit a candle, but maybe he would hold a candle. Holding a candle is muktzah. Muktzah is a rabbinic decree. Lighting a candle is biblical. That's just a thought that comes to my mind because I see the terminology the Meiri uses, that he says it's talking about bein hashmashos. The way the Meiri is learning is different than Rashi. Rashi seems to be saying it's after Shabbos is over. But the Meiri learns that we're talking about it's at the end of Shabbos where it becomes the gray area, where Shabbos is over, but it's not 100% over. It's over because it's sunset, but it's not over because it's not dusk yet. So it's called that gray area where we normally don't do any work, but the child is holding a candle. We're not saying he lit it now. He's holding a candle. Maybe it was lit throughout Shabbos. It was the fire that was burning throughout Shabbos, but he's holding it now. And the fact that he's holding it, it must be that that it's a kosher flame. If it's a Jewish child, it has to be that it's a kosher flame. Just a thought. I don't know. I have to think about that actually. Okay. Anyway, the Gemara continues now and mentions that the fire has to be used for light. And this is going back to Robert's point. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a brisa. Haya mahale chutz lekrach. If a person was going outside the walled city, or the big city, and v'ra'a, and he saw a flame. We're about 25 lines from the top of the page. If anyone doesn't know where we are, I would say maybe 30 lines from the top of the page. Im ava kafi hakivshan, if it is a thick fire, like the opening of the kivshan, the furnace, like a big oven, and the furnace was used to make limestone, or to burn. They would burn limestone to make some type of I don't know the chemistry, but they would burn limestone to make some type of tar or something like that. So this fire, if it's very thick, mevarech olav, you can recite the bracha of bayrei me'orei ha'esh, because for sure this fire, if it's as big as like a furnace, then it must be to give light. Now, be'imlav, if it's not so big, einay mevarech olav, do not recite the bracha on it, because it probably was meant for cooking purposes or for some other purpose. It's not used to give light. So what this means is that if something is obviously used to give light, then there's no problem. Like a candle, let's say. Usually you're not cooking with a candle. Candle generally used to give light. Here we're dealing with a big flame. Big flames, there are different purposes for it. And if it's a very big flame, then we say it must be, in the olden days, that's what they would light up their house. That was their chandelier in the olden days that they would use. It was a big flame. It would light up the house. It would give light, and that was considered the kosher for Havdalah. Okay, Tani Chada. We learned in one place, Ur shel kivshan mevarchen olav. The fire of a furnace, you can recite the bracha bayrei me'orei ha'esh, on a fire of a furnace. V'tanya idach, and we learned in another brisa, ein mevarchen olav, you cannot recite the bracha of a fire of a furnace. Like Hasha, the Gemara says, you know what? It's not a question. It's not a contradiction. Ha betchila, this that it prohibits reciting a bracha on a furnace is in the beginning of lighting up this furnace, when it's burning the limestone, and then it's the purpose of the fire is for burning purposes. Halibasayf, The brisa that says it's permissible is talking about if after the limestone has been burned already, a majority has been burned at least, then they would make this fire bigger in order to use for light. So Rashi brings down over here they would light madlikin or gadol milmaila. They would light a big fire above to get rid of the burnt stones, to clean up the burnt, I guess the leftover pieces. Again, I wish I understood this better because I don't burn limestone, but they would somehow make an additional fire that would clean up the burning of the stones, and they would use that fire for light. So this is a case where you had an initial fire that was not used for light. You can't use that for Havdalah. And an additional fire that was at the end, that fire was used for light, and that you would be allowed to recite a bracha on.
Rabbi, maybe the last fire is for cleaning up. There is not enough real limestone in there. It's just the leftovers, and they want to clean it all out with the stuff that is already burned. And then when they light the new stones, it's a bigger fire and it's a new fire. So for light, they use just the leftovers.
Something along those lines. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. In other words, what I'm not sure is why it says that they would make this fire above. But in other words, it was not in the same exact place as the other one, or it was just on top of the other.
No, it has a
directly
bigger
on top.
flame. It has a bigger flame. Maybe it shows up on top too.
Mhm.
The new stones would have a bigger flame. They would show up on top.
And the new flame they made big, or gadol. They would madlikin or gadol milmaila, lamarek streifas avanim, and they would also use it for light. So this is not the original fire. It seems like it's well, I guess it's the same flame. They must use the fire from below. It ignites whatever they put on top. I guess they put stuff on top to burn and clean up the oven. So they put stuff on top, but
yeah, maybe to keep the fire going.
in other words, there's a small fire left maybe on the bottom, and then they would make a bigger fire above it, which they would clean out the oven, and they would also use it for its light, which is interesting because what we're seeing here is that you could have a fire that's meant for two things. It's meant for light and for cleaning up.
Yeah.
So it sounds from this Rashi that that's acceptable. And we'll have to talk more about that tomorrow. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.